Okay, it's time for the panel discussion phase of today's event. I'm Brink, Lindsey. I'm a senior scholar at the Kauffman Foundation. Just on a personal note, it's a great pleasure for me to be on the platform here. Last year, I attended the first State of Entrepreneurship event as an interested onlooker. Kauffman Foundation kept, and particularly the work of Bob Lighten, kept popping up on my radar screen, so I thought I would come to this event and check it out and see what Kauffman was up to. And clearly, I liked what I found out because just a few months ago, I moved over to Kauffman as a senior scholar, so delighted to be here. And delighted very much to be hosting this panel of distinguished experts. Just to introduce everyone quickly, here we have Arthur Brooks, who's president of the American Enterprise Institute, E.J. Dionne, triple threat, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, professor at Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute, and columnist for the Washington Post. On my immediate left is Philip Howard, who is founder and chair of Common Good, a nonprofit, nonpartisan legal reform coalition. And on my far left, George Priest, a professor at Yale Law School and head of the Olin Center of Law, Economics, and Public Policy. Yes. So, just to get things started, I would like to invite each of the panelists to sound off for a couple of minutes in reaction to Carl's talk. So Arthur, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Brink, and thanks to all of you. It's a delight to be here. I think that we all thought that Carl's talk was really impactful and full of interesting facts, and I want to emphasize what I consider to be the most important point that Carl made today. And it's the point that I think that we need to take out of this fantastic volume that each of you has a copy of. It's very easy when we talk about entrepreneurship to talk about the regulatory environment for entrepreneurship to effectively start in the middle of the story. And the middle of the story is, how do we get more and better entrepreneurship? That sounds like the first question, but in fact it isn't, because it assumes that we want more entrepreneurship in our society. Now, at the same time, we have a lot of policies and politics around us that would suggest that we actually don't want more, because on both sides of the aisle, left, right, and center in American politics today, it's very easy to find a lack of a governing philosophy that would get out of the way of entrepreneurs, and that in fact would be serious not just about what government should do in the private sector, but what the government should not do or should do less in the private sector. To get a better governing philosophy, we need to actually articulate consistently and forcefully the why of entrepreneurship, and we need all of us to be able to do it every day, as far as I'm concerned. So here's what I think is the why of entrepreneurship, and Carl touched on this in a bunch of different ways. The entrepreneurship is, let me start by saying the why. Here's the wrong answer to the why of entrepreneurship. It makes us really rich. That is true. But that's not the primary reason that we actually want it, and we should, in my view, want more of it. The right answer is that it expresses the value of earned success for our society. Entrepreneurship is the pinnacle of who we are expressively, as far as I'm concerned. It is a fact, according to Gallup, that the favorability rating of entrepreneurs in our society right now is 86%. Now compare this to the 13% that we see for Congress, and you get an idea of what is truly the cultural pillar of our society, and the almost unambiguous fact that entrepreneurship goes far beyond simply being an economic alternative, and truly is, in my view, a moral imperative. A vote for entrepreneurship with better policies is a vote for an opportunity society. A vote against entrepreneurship in our politics and policies is a vote for an entitlement society, and that's, I think, the key takeaway that we have to remember and to be able to articulate.
E.J.?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I turned out today to do something I always warn my kids not to do, which is I didn't listen carefully to the assignment. So I have here a carefully prepared 10-minute talk, which is what I thought I was supposed to begin with. But Brink is a libertarian and believes in free expression, so he's told me I could parcel it out in chunks as we go along. I think I was invited here to be a dissenter, and I just got a great sort of piece of freedom to do that. My old friend Doug Schoen is in the audience, and when Doug saw me on the panel, he told Carl Schramm, I've known EJ for 40 years. He was wrong then, he's wrong now. And actually, that was very liberating, Doug. So I want to thank you very much. I also want to say that as a newspaper columnist, I'm accustomed to dissent. You get a lot of it from your readers, and my favorite, one of my favorites began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And so whatever else you get out of my remarks today, you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. Before I dissent, and I'll leave my dissent to later on largely, I do want to say that I don't think anyone dissents at some level from appreciating what entrepreneurs do. Coming in, I noticed among the drinks a drink called Honest Tea. Many of you may know it. Just last night, my wife and I were at my son's basketball game, and we ran into Seth Goldman, the founder of Honest Tea. Our kids played baseball together about a decade ago when they were young, just when Seth was mixing this product in his kitchen. And lo and behold, 10 years in 2008, Coca-Cola bought 40% of Honest Tea. And my wife and I told him that we have been cheering him for all these years. And I think that's a classic kind of American entrepreneurial story. He didn't like the drinks he had to drink after he came back from running because they were too sweet. He started mixing one for himself, and lo and behold, he's created a successful product. So entrepreneurship is a wonderful thing. And I also want to salute Carl for offering, I think, a really important insight that I'd love us to explore on the difference between small business and new business. Because we know in Washington that a lot of interests that have nothing to do with small business as we commonly understand it hide behind that label to extract all kinds of benefits from government, which tend only to reinforce already privileged positions. So I think this point about new firms, not necessarily small firms, again, much as we all like small business, could actually be helpful to policy. And I hope you can continue to refine and improve on that. I wouldn't mind if you also devoted some attention to fostering more investment by American business into American workers, in America, into our country's future. Two other ideas in the report I think are useful. We must reform our immigration laws, and we need to focus on how immigration reform can foster economic growth and opportunity for all Americans. I cheer the idea that existing businesses might help open the door for other new entrepreneurs. That sounded almost socialist to me, but that wouldn't bother me the way it might bother my friend Arthur Brooks to my right. I will just close by where I dissent because I hope we can get back to it. And my two broad dissents are related. I think the idea of moving away, and this means no one in this particular audience will applaud me, moving away from income taxes to consumption taxes is a truly terrible idea that will only further concentrate wealth and income in a country that suffers from excessively concentrated wealth and income. And I believe that because while I love entrepreneurs, I actually believe in the labor theory of value, a point of view held by Abraham Lincoln, probably not often represented at Kauffman events. And so I will have fun later on in this session to defend that view. But I salute Carl because he understands that disagreement is one of the joys of freedom. Thank you.
Philip.
Well, good. I'm glad you've dissented because then I can agree wholeheartedly. I think it's incredibly important for Kauffman to be focusing on the role of law and the economy. It's been, well, I've spent 20 years writing about the effects of law on human behavior, and to me, the problem is argued in Washington in the wrong dimension. It's either less regulation or more regulation, where to me it's all how you regulate. Law is incredibly important for free activity and for free choices and entrepreneurial activity. If you have too little law, then you get bullies running the markets. If you have too much law, then it's tripwires, and people go through the day looking over their shoulders. So it's very important to focus on the legal foundation, which is more important, not less important, in an interdependent, anonymous, global world where you don't know who put the lead paint on your toys or who you're contracting with over the internet. So law and regulation are vital and important, but it's important that they be predictable and reliable. And if you have people going through the day listening to a little lawyer on their shoulders, or tripping over rules that they didn't even know exist, then you're not going to have an environment conducive for entrepreneurial activity. It is impossible to start a business today and comply with law. It is impossible. I challenge you to try to comply, to open a restaurant, to do anything even small, not to mention something big. The employment laws, the safety laws, one after, literally thousands of laws. We're now working on a project with the City of New York to simplify small business regulation. It's incoherent. I've got 8 lawyers at Covington and Burling working on this, trying to understand themselves how these laws actually work. How could a small business person possibly do it? So law has to become coherent to the people expected to abide by it. Doesn't mean you don't have regulation, but it does have to be coherent. It is not coherent. So one of the great challenges, so I have one thing to say, which is I think we need a dramatic overhaul of the legal structure of this country, and the purpose of it is not to, quote, deregulate, but to make it accessible to humans and relate more closely to the goals of the reasonable goals of regulation. So the bureaucratic system of very minute rules that tell everybody exactly how to do everything, it's just central planning. It's nothing different than central planning. It's different in this sense. The people who wrote it are dead. Whereas at least central planners would get together every 5 years and come up with a bad new central plan. So it is more or less literally accurate that democracy is run by dead people. Andrew Cuomo goes to Albany, 80% of the budget is embedded in legal concrete. Enacted, deals agreed to, or laws passed by people who are no longer with us. That's not a vital democracy. One aspect of this problem is bureaucracy. A second, which I'm going to leave to George, is litigation. Unreliable litigation is an incredible damper and friction on entrepreneurial activity. But the other area that no one talks about is the management of government. Government now either spends or uses itself 1/3 of the GDP. No one, look, 22.5 million people work at all levels of government in this country. They are unmanageable because of the accretion of civil service rules, union work rules. It's unmanageable. At best, pick a number, it's 50% effective. They are as shackled with the rules as we are. It has this rippling effect in society. Good graduates don't want to go and have a career in government. Who would? You're not allowed to think for yourself. So it's a terrible system that squanders money, makes regulation ineffective for the first reason I stated, because it's very prescriptive, but it also shackles these people. We need a fundamental rethinking of the rules of how government itself is managed, because in a market, you're accountable to the marketplace. Government has to be accountable in a different way, in the marketplace of democracy. It has become completely unaccountable by law. You can't fire somebody. You can't fire somebody who doesn't show up for work. I mean, look at the teacher tenure rules. They're simply mirror the rules for other forms of public service. So if we want to create an entrepreneurial environment where people in general make choices, where law supports free activity and not, you have to look at in the big picture, how the society is being run. Who's making the choices of what these rules are? Who's making common choices? Because that can be entrepreneurial too. And the answer is, they're all shackled. They're all shackled by this accumulation of law. So I think we're at one of those points in history where it happens every 30 or 40 years with the rights revolution, the New Deal, the progressive era. You go back through our history. We're at one of those points where we have to fundamentally remodel our government, do a dramatic spring cleaning. Kauffman's performing an incredible service, focusing on these basically free changes. Not to get rid of government, not to do what conservatives say, but to make it work effectively for a free society.
And George.
Thanks, Brink. I'm happy to be here. I've been invited here, I think, because I'm one of the contributors to the Rules of Growth book and was involved with Bob Lighton, who was really the guiding force in the book in organizing it and working on various parts of it. Let me tell you a little about the book. As Carl has well described in his talk, the book is and should be read immediately. That is, there are proposals in the book. Yeah, I say modestly.
Which chapter?
Yeah. You can hold off for about half an hour.
But it is worth reading immediately because, as Carl pointed out, it sets forth a set of rules for growth that can be implemented immediately. And that as Carl and Philip have mentioned, are costless, don't require budget allocations, but it sets forth rules and changes in legal rules that will immediately spur economic growth. So it's worth reading now for that reason alone. There's a larger purpose, though, to the book, at least as I see it, and I think as Bob Lighton and Carl see it as well. Let me give you just a little academic history to set it in context. Roughly 50 years ago, basically at the University of Chicago, but also to some extent at Yale Law School, where I teach now, a field of study started called law and economics. And it basically consisted of the application of economic analysis to legal rules, so that it was bringing an outside scientific discipline, economics, to the analysis of legal rules, which had really not been done before, or had been done only sporadically before. Over the past 50 years, this field of law and economics, now consisting of not only lawyers and law professors, but economists, policymakers, and many others, has vastly changed our legal system, vastly changed. You can see it in particular in the field of antitrust, where the rules have been totally overturned. The rules that prevailed in the 1950s and 60s have been totally overturned, but you can see it if you read a lot of laws or read a lot of cases in lots of other fields too, in tort law, contract law, certainly in corporation law, certainly in the analysis of mergers and acquisitions and securities. Law and economics, the application of economic analysis to law has vastly changed the law. Indeed, there is probably no judge that goes on the bench today at any federal level, district court, appellate court, or even the Supreme Court, that isn't aware of law and economics, and some, such as both Justice Breyer and Justice Scalia, view themselves as experts in the field. The principal effect of this work, or the principal subject of the application of economic analysis to law, was to study the effects of law, the economic effects of law. And so the change in law that has resulted has come from identifying those effects and deciding whether those effects are good or bad, what law will have what effect, and the like. This book aspires, this book and this approach, I think this is just the first of a set of books, aspires to push that analysis further by focusing on the effect of laws on economic growth. Not simply the effects, good or bad, more or less for one party or another, who benefits, who loses, but rather how can the legal system in general, not only the regulatory system and the system of federal government, but the legal system as it operates in individual lawsuits, in contract disputes, and tort disputes, property disputes, how can the legal system be reconceptualized so as to promote economic growth? Now, this is a not totally apparent, but I think deep ambition of the book and of this project by the Kauffman Foundation to change the way lawyers, law professors, and economists think about the legal system. It's been an important change to begin to think about, to begin to apply economic analysis and think about the effects of law. But now the effort of this book, and I think it's going to be a successful effort, is to lead all of these people studying the law, judges and lawyers, to think about how legal rules can be designed to promote economic growth. I think this is the start of what is going to be a revolutionary project in understanding the legal system, which joined with projects such as Phillips and Arthur's, and as soon as we convince EJ of the importance of the work, is going to have a major effect over the coming decades on our legal system.
George, if I could just follow up, Carl mentioned some of the bottom line proposals that are featured in the book. He talked about immigration policy, technology transfer, and tax reform. I wonder if you might highlight a couple of the other analyses or proposals that are in this book. You could start with the chapters that you wrote.
Well, there are 20, I think 20 chapters, as I recall, 20 chapters in the book. And Carl mentioned, I think, 3 of them. Each one of the chapters is designed to address a different area of law, or regulation, and to, in a way, as I say, reconceptualize it. Think about how that area of law can be reformed so as to promote economic growth, written by someone who is an expert in that field. So there is a chapter on labor law. We've mentioned immigration. There's a chapter. I wrote a chapter on tort law. I also wrote a chapter on how tort law has changed over the years and how it can be, this was the point Philip was making, how it can be reformed to promote economic growth further. I wrote a chapter on antitrust law that deals with reforming modern antitrust law to deal more effectively with network industries. There are chapters on contract law, chapters on corporation law, chapters on zoning. It's really a comprehensive treatment of wide areas of the legal system.
Thanks. Philip, I want to dig into some of the things you were talking about, but first I can't resist mentioning Philip is author of a number of highly regarded and hotly debated books. But if there were a poll of Washingtonians for the scariest book title ever, it would have to be your latest book would win hands down, Life Without Lawyers. But if you could,
Lucky I don't live in D.C.
if
Very popular in New York.
if you could, yeah. If you could, a lot of times here in Washington, when we talk about what is to be done, we're thinking about sort of big, broad public policy moves, big new statutes, things that get talking heads yelling at each other on TV. But so much of where the action is this subterranean, invisible, not transparent, niggling little details. So maybe your work on New York laws is an interesting way to kind of bore into that. Tell us a little bit about that and what kinds of devilish details you've been turning up.
Well, I mean you can't. First of all, government is now, and the special interests and government together are an engine of the status quo. You can add law slowly. You can never subtract law. That's the history of a mature democracy. Entitlements never go away. It all gets stacked up. So ultimately, like sediment in the harbor, you can't get anywhere. So the school system. There's a rule being debated in New York right now. It's called last in, first out. We're going to have all kinds of layoffs to balance budgets. There's this law, it's a statute in New York State, that basically dictates in great detail exactly who gets laid off when, but essentially if you have a terrible teacher in an unrelated area who hasn't been teaching for years because he or she is so terrible, and you have a bright young teacher who just won the Teacher of the Year award after a year, that bright young teacher has to get laid off as a matter of statute, and the person who doesn't even have the right expertise, who's been sitting in a rubber room or something, gets the job. And if you try to parse the statutory language, you can get to the point, but basically what you understand after you read, there's actually not counting the regulations, 4 pages of dense statutory text on this. What you understand is that nobody alive has the authority to use their judgment to do anything that anyone would think is right. That this law, written by some people who are no longer with us, actually in 1976 is when the law was passed, tries to dictate every possible situation. And so there they are. These people literally are in handcuffs, everybody. The unions couldn't even do anything with it if they wanted to. I mean, it's all, it's law. It's the rule of law.
So it's in the DNA of lawyers who write our laws to try to imagine, foresee, and deal with and advance every contingency. Is there some sort of revolution in thinking that has to take place to let our lawmakers let go of that level of control?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a part of the culture. So I think, and I propose this, we move the national capital to Kansas City because first of all, we have a very good facility already there, and the advantage of moving the national capital to Kansas City, or indeed anywhere else, is that nobody in Washington could move with it because they wouldn't be able to sell their homes. So you have this fantastic new fresh start, like democracy will be like 1776 again, with people who are just trying to do what's right instead of, getting lost in this jungle.
That's crazy talk. Doing what's right in Washington. EJ, it's your turn now to vent about consumption taxes and
Well, first of all, I wouldn't have
dust
any
off the labor
objection
theory of
to
value.
moving the capital to Kansas City because I would challenge anybody in the Tea Party or anyone who hates government to say, I'm anti-Kansas City, the way they say anti-Washington. Let me just, a few quick things. First, George is right about the influence of law in economics, and as he knows, there are many of us who don't simply view it as bringing economics to the study of law, which is a useful thing, but it's also, for many of us, been a way of bringing a libertarian political bias to the study of law. And it represents one school of thought that has been competing in the law schools, as he knows, with all kinds of other schools, and partly because some of the progressive schools to which I am familiar have not withstood the test of time the way theirs have. Law and economics is one, but I think it's important. The law is about consumers, citizens, and employees as well as being about investors and employers. And I agree with Phil that we need to reform government. In particular, I think we really need to reform the way government hires, which is a very complicated process, because we do need to bring in talent to government. I disagree. I speak as a consumer of electricity from Pepco, that government is uniquely hobbled or incompetent, that there are perfectly good and entrepreneurial people who work in government. And I find it curious that we complain about government bureaucrats in a way we never complain when we have trouble getting relief from bankers, insurance companies, cable companies, or any of the other people who sometimes behave as inefficiently as our DMV. I don't say they all do. Not all DMVs don't work. If I were governor, the first thing I'd fix is the DMV, because it's the first place everybody experiences government. But that goes to my larger point, which is what I worry about in these conversations, and the reason I find myself a dissenter is we always leave out the ways in which government itself has been a driver of innovation in our country. One of the greatest drivers of growth in our history was the GI Bill, which invested in individuals and afforded them opportunities for education and property ownership that they simply wouldn't have had if government hadn't taken a risk on them. Federal student loan programs, Pell Grants continue that tradition. Of course, we all know about government investment in infrastructure, which we need more of, which allows entrepreneurs to move their goods. I'd also say that the labor movement has raised wages, creating mass purchasing power that fuel generations of economic growth. My friend who sells honest tea couldn't sell it if people didn't have honest labor to earn income to pay for honest tea. And that's where this consumption tax idea really bothers me. I think there is a case to be made, perhaps if we have trouble closing the deficit, for a progressive VAT to supplement government revenue. But I think that what we're looking at now is a tax system that actually vastly favors investment over labor. It was Warren Buffett who said that he pays tax at a higher rate than his receptionist. And I think that's a problem, and I think a consumption tax would actually worsen.
Yeah,
I'm sorry?
Lower, not higher.
I mean, he pays, thank you for correcting me. See, he is an expert in law and economics. Yes, he pays tax at he had no reason to do that. That was a very altruistic act. But he pays tax.
I still have hopes.
Yeah, well, thank you. But he pays tax at a lower rate than his secretary. I think a consumption tax would worsen that. I think there are many ways to improve the economic climate, the entrepreneurial climate, but I don't think that's one we should pursue.
Arthur, let me turn to the politics of the matter. We have, I think, a felt urgency across the political spectrum these days to revive economic growth, to revive job creation. A greater appreciation now, perhaps than previously, on the left side of the political spectrum of the urgency of economic growth. During the long boom, lots of complaints about the distribution of growth and so forth, but now that growth has stopped, everybody wants to get it started. But of course, everyone has different ideas about how to do so. So how do we get there from here? You wrote a book last year called The Battle, in which you argued, and I think you sort of hit on this in your opening comments, that economic policy, the case for better economic policy should be made in terms of values, not just in terms of kind of technocratic management. Indeed, you went so far as to say that we should really have a new culture war over economics. Do you still think that that's the best way to go? How is that vulnerable to kind of putting some people who may have value clashes on a left-right basis, who might otherwise be susceptible to a message of making a policy more favorable to entrepreneurs? Is there a risk that values-laden talk could produce polarization rather than leading towards consensus on an issue that we really need to get everybody on board on?
You know, I appreciate that observation. I'd like to start off by saying I don't favor moving the government to Kansas City because I have nothing against Kansas City, and I think that would be terrible for Kansas City. I like Kansas City. I hate to spoil it. The other quick observation that I would make is I don't think it's a very strong argument in favor of government that it's not as terrible as Pepco. I live in Maryland, too, and it truly is ghastly service. And I think what it points out is that the threats to liberty and the threats to entrepreneurship can come every bit as much from government-managed monopoly and crony capitalism as it can from overweening, overgrowing government. So I wouldn't want anybody to take the case away that advocates of free enterprise should always say that government is always and everywhere the problem and cutting government will provide the solutions. I think that the last financial crisis that we've all suffered shows us in abundant detail that the proximity of large corporations to government, the relationship that's too cozy, that is just as bad for entrepreneurs, is just as bad for growth, and it's just as bad for the vitality of democratic capitalism as is government per se. I think that's a very important thing to point out. Now, onto the issue of how we talk about this in the values context. I mean, I think in my own work, I've identified the fact that there's a big culture clash, and I have identified it as a culture war. I think that identifying it is very different than declaring it. I think that there are workarounds to this. And once again, we have to be careful with the metaphor. In point of fact, what we're talking about here is the competition of ideas. That's fundamental to a free society. I mean, EJ pointed that out earlier. I think it's really critical to remember that no matter how bitter our disagreements get about the size of government or any of the things that we talk about in this conversation, this still truly is an extraordinary nation where we can talk about these things openly without the threat of a knock in the night and a jackbooted thug because we voted the wrong way or because we come down on the wrong side of the issue. So all of the metaphors notwithstanding, I do want to point that out, and I think we could all agree about that and celebrate that fact. I think it's important for us to define our values, however. And the reason for that is that we find that in the United States, we have a far, far stronger affinity, cultural affinity for the free enterprise system that can and should cut across the ideological, otherwise ideological and political spectrum. This truly is an extraordinary thing about the United States, and it's a source of our strength and vitality. If you ask Americans, do you believe that the principal role of government should be to redistribute income from rich to poor, only about 33% of Americans will agree. If you ask that same question in Spain, 77% of Spaniards will agree. This truly is a cultural difference between us and our friends and our allies in social democratic Western Europe. Some people may regret that difference, but I think it's actually something that we should celebrate. Nothing is more evocative of that difference than current protests that we see. In Greece, where protesters, civil servants and people who belong to labor unions burned down a public building, demanding more lavish pensions, earlier retirement, and their salaries be paid by their fellow citizens during the worst recession in the past 50 years of their country. In the United States, people are protesting, whether we like them or not, people are protesting against the government doing more. This is an example of American exceptionalism. Now, some people regret it, I hasten to add again, but from my point of view, it's actually a very encouraging thing.
Could I just quickly say I'm very glad that Arthur has almost acknowledged that certain forms of deregulation helped bring about the financial crisis. And I heartily agree with you that saying government is no worse than Pepco is not a good way to defend government. My point is only that we should not demonize government in the way we do compared to private industry without any regard to what parts of government we're talking about or what parts of private enterprise we're talking about. And I also don't think we can treat democratic government as something apart from us because in a democracy it is us and it's our job to change it, and that's why we have arguments about what to do.
So I have about umpteen more questions on my little list I want to throw at you gentlemen, and I know we could just let it rip, but time is growing short, and I did want to get a couple of questions from the audience. Philip, did you want to say 30 seconds and then we'll...
Yeah, I just want to give an example of government being shackled so it can't do the right thing. Infrastructure, the Interstate Highway Act was passed in 1956. It was about 29 pages long. 14 years later, it was substantially completed. Today, if President Obama wanted to do that, have a green grid, wind farms, new power lines and stuff, 14 years later, not a shovel would be in the ground because the way environmental impact statements and other things have mutated into a process of no pebble left unturned, followed by litigation, followed by new multi-thousand page. People literally in government don't have the authority to make choices. So the shackling that's going on is not because of, in my view, inept bureaucrats. It's because of this accretion of rules that don't allow anyone in or out of government, to make choices. And I think that's not widely recognized. We view it as us versus them. In fact, it's like powerlessness corrupts. It's this common thing that's happened in our society.
George?
I just wanted to respond to EJ on one point. First, I don't think you're right in saying law and economics is a libertarian movement. I don't think that's true. But one thing I do want to emphasize is this book and the new approach that's being taken in this book really has nothing to do with libertarianism. I don't think there is. I haven't read all the chapters the last night, but I looked it over. Some of my new others I looked more carefully at. I don't know that there's any chapter that you'd identify as libertarian within this book. And the effort of this book and of this project is not to eliminate government and not to eliminate the law or change the law or do without lawyers entirely, but rather to redirect, to reform government, to reform the law, to redirect government and the law so it promotes economic growth. So it creates jobs and gives jobs to people that don't have jobs now. So there's much more to this book than law and economics, but much more to this book than libertarianism, too.
Okay, let me let the audience get in on the act, and I will call on you. A mic will come to you, and just give your name, and you can address the question to one or more of the panelists. Governor Gilmore.
First, let me just say to Philip Howard, I'm startled to hear that the government takes 33% of our GDP. At least there's room for growth, right? But addressing George Priest. George, I thought you gave a very optimistic view about law and economics. But in contrast to that, what we've really seen over the last 10 years has been the advent of Sarbanes-Oxley and now Dodd-Frank. Aren't these actually contrary to that, and these kinds of developments are going to make things much, much harder on growth and entrepreneurship in the United States?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. But I think the law and economics community has been quite skeptical and critical of Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. Not successfully. Again, politics, law and economics doesn't rule the world. Politics has an important place. And all law and economics can do is try and describe what the effects are, but I think the prediction of the effects has been negative for both Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. But again, it is the effort of the discipline to try and show that, so that if there's room for reform, it will try and point the way.
Been great for lawyers' business. I mean, boards now have like 6 sets of lawyers.
Right there.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Sekero. I'm a small woman-owned business here in the District of Columbia. So just as an entrepreneur, so it's not only the big businesses that are in Washington, D.C. What I want to say is, how do you compare entrepreneurship with the new President's export initiative, looking at entrepreneurship? How are they incorporated in, or how can they work with that initiative, looking at export and also looking at immigration reform? Where we are exporting to, I come from Africa, I come from Kenya. We also have entrepreneurs, as you said, of immigration reform. These people, as we export American products to Africa or any country, they would also like to bring their products, which are raw materials, to America. How can the law look into that or put into the entrepreneurship?
I don't know who wants to take a crack at that. Arthur, do you want to say something about evaluating the president's export initiative, or also his sort of rediscovery or new emphasis on entrepreneurship and innovation in recent months and recent weeks, and how that stacks up against what AEI is looking at as where we should be going?
The export initiative, I don't think we know quite enough yet to be able to assess a lot about its effectiveness. But I think that I really welcome the more of the entrepreneurial focus from the administration. I think it's great for the administration politically for all the right reasons. People like it, and people like it because it's something they consider to be very, very good for our country, and especially appropriate at this particular time. And I think that ultimately it will contribute to the success and legacy of the administration, that it's intending to help you. And it's intending to help people who are in this room, people who share all of our enthusiasm for what the real vitality and energy in the American economy is. So I think, it's evidence of the fact that this is a really great thing is the fact that the Kauffman Foundation is deeply involved in it. I mean, the Kauffman Foundation doesn't do anything simply to get close to an administration in Washington, D.C. It has to be around something of real content. So I think that's sort of as much proof as many people can and should need.
Could I just say quickly, I think one of the interesting sort of side effects of the import initiative, and I agree, I'm not sure we know enough about it to judge it in any way, is that in his State of the Union speech, President Obama talked about the need to reform and modernize government. And I got to say, when Bill Clinton was president and Al Gore was doing the Reinventing Government initiative, I sometimes thought that I was the only person, certainly in the column writing world, and maybe the only person outside of Al Gore and Elaine Kamarck who was working on it, who actually thought the Reinventing Government initiative was important. Because I do think, and you hear it just in the talk of this panel, that if you are a progressive, which I would call myself, or a liberal, you are looking to government to do some important things that you think can move the country forward, and that includes moving it forward in the economic area. If government is easily parodied, or worse still, does things that make it easy to parody, then this is not good for people who are progressive. And so I am actually hoping that the administration really moves this agenda of government reform in a serious way and talks about it a lot more. They actually took some steps on IT, on hiring in the first 2 years. I hope it's a bigger part of the administration in the second 2 years.
I'd love to keep this going, but alas, we've hit the end of our time. So I would like all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.